Support for WUWM podcasts comes from University School of Milwaukee, fulfilling a values-based mission of developing learners, fostering leaders, and preparing citizens for pre-kindergarten through 12th grade. More information at usm.org/mission.
From 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, this is Lake Effect. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Today, we'll look at the long-term impact of the dropping birth rate in Milwaukee.
The conversations you hear about school consolidation, school closings in MPS they've got to happen. There just aren't as many kids as there used to be, and all signs point to there being fewer in the future.
Then we'll speak with a historian about the lessons we can take away from the Holocaust.
The Nazi rise to power and the sort of what unfolds across society, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over a number of years, and it's small steps along the way.
Plus, Bubbler Talk takes a deep dive into the history of the St. Joan of Arc Chapel at Marquette University. All that's coming up on Lake Effect. This is Lake Effect from 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Thanks for joining us today. Wisconsin's population grew by 3.6% in the last census, but that data also shed light on another reality. The state's youth population is continuing to decline. It's been a trend that's played out slowly over the last 2 decades, but now that trend is accelerating, especially here in Milwaukee. John Johnson is a research fellow at the Marquette Law School Lubar Center, and he recently published data on Milwaukee's so-called baby bust. He joins Lake Effect's Joy Powers to talk about it and what the baby bust could mean for the city's future.
What is a baby bust?
So we're seeing fewer and fewer babies born in Milwaukee each year, which is not in itself a surprise because the number of births is declining pretty much everywhere. But it's happening pretty quickly here, more quickly than I expected. So the number of babies born last year in the city of Milwaukee was about 7,400, a little less than that. That's down 5% from 2024. It's down 15% from 2020 and 29% fewer than in 2010.
So this is really the opposite of, let's say, a baby boom. Are there explanations for what we're seeing? Because as your data found, this is a trend that's happening kind of everywhere, but in the city of Milwaukee, we're really outpacing the trend.
Yeah, there's 2 things contributing to this. One of them is that moms are having fewer babies. Fewer people are having babies, and then people who do have babies are usually having fewer of them. So that's happening, and it happens at different times for different groups. So like we saw the birth rate for white mothers fall pretty quickly, and then we're seeing a similar thing happen for Black moms and Latino moms. So you see these things happen at different times for different racial groups, and because of the composition of racial groups in Milwaukee being different than, say, the suburbs of the rest of the state, the timing is a little different in the different places. So that's part of it. But the speed at which it is happening in Milwaukee suggests to me that we're also seeing this as the result of people moving out of the city before they start families. So like over the course of the 2010s, we had this big drop in the number of babies born in the city of Milwaukee, whereas the number of babies born to moms living in the suburbs stayed the same across the decade.
What's the upshot here? What's the impact on Milwaukee? Fewer babies. That information by itself feels pretty neutral.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a thing that is true about the world, but it has some important repercussions, beginning with hospitals that deliver babies. So, we saw a maternity ward shut down on the south side a couple of years ago. I believe there was some reporting from WWM on that. And then you see this with daycares. I don't have great data on this yet, but I have noticed anecdotally I'm at that stage of life where many people I know are having babies. And I've talked to a lot of people who've had a really easy time getting into daycare, which is not something I've traditionally heard. But I know of multiple daycares that have no waiting list at all, some that don't even staff all of their newborn rooms because they don't have demand for it right now. And then, of course, we see this in schools as well. So first grade enrollment has fallen a lot, tracking with the lower number of kids born 6 years earlier. In a bigger picture, it's not entirely clear what this means for Milwaukee overall, this pattern of declining birth rates across the board, because in other countries, like Japan, for instance, the birth rate is lowest in the cities and higher in the rural areas, but the population of the rural areas is falling while the cities are staying stable or even growing. And that's because the people who are born in rural areas, when they grow to be young adults, they frequently move to the city. So how this plays out in the long run is sometimes counterintuitive.
But one of the things your article mentions is really the impact on schools. So yes, when people get older, they may be moving to Milwaukee, but if they're not staying here to have kids, what is the impact that has on our school systems?
Yeah, just fewer kids attending school. So we see this, it's a pretty direct relationship, and it happens quite consistently. Fewer kids are born. We know that we have a net outflow of children ages 0 to 5 in Milwaukee. More of them move out of the city than move in. Their families move out of the city. And so the number of sixth graders that we get is always less than the number of kids born in the city 6 years earlier. And this always affects each kind of school. You know, it happens across sectors. So here we have a lot of private schools and charter schools and then district schools. It's going to affect all of them. And it means that the conversations you hear about school consolidation, school closings and MPS they've got to happen. There just aren't as many kids as there used to be, and all signs point to there being fewer in the future. That doesn't make the importance of education less. You know, it doesn't mean that we need to spend less money on that. My fear is that we'll be spending all of this money maintaining buildings instead of educating kids, because the buildings were built for a time when we had many, many more students than we do now.
So when I look at this issue, I see a lot of solutions that really rely on more federal or state policy changes. These are things like, subsidizing childcare in different ways, making it easier to have children. Most of those solutions are going to really lie in the hands of people at the state or federal level. Is there anything to try to reverse or even just blunt this trend at the city level?
Yeah, the simplest solution is immigration, which rests with the federal government as well, to your point. But what the city can do is focus on the reasons why young families are net leavers of the city instead of movers here. So, yeah, you're not really going to drive the birth rate up, particularly at a municipal level, but you can affect some of the reasons that so many families feel like when they're planning on having a kid or right after they've had a kid that now's the time they need to leave the city. I think focusing on school quality is a really important way to do that. Again, focusing on the quality of schools and not maintaining the same number of school buildings to serve this dwindling number of students. And then, all the other kinds of quality of life issues that affect families, crime, housing quality, that kind of stuff.
For sure. Well, John Johnson, thank you as always for joining us here on Lake Effect.
It's always a pleasure.
John Johnson is a research fellow at the Marquette Law School Lubar Center. He joined Lake Effect's Joy Powers. Last Tuesday was International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It's a day to remember the 6 million Jews who were rounded up into ghettos and murdered in concentration camps around Europe. It's also a day to listen to the survivors and learn about those who helped rescue them. Teaching about the Holocaust doesn't just happen one day a year. It continues year-round. Samantha Abramson is one of those educators as the executive director of the Holocaust Education Resource Center in Milwaukee. She joins WUWM's Mayan Silver to talk about what we can take away from European society's descent into the systemic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of Jews.
What we're going to do is start with a little history. Germany was a democracy for 14 years. Jews lived there in relative prosperity. Then Hitler was appointed chancellor in 1933. He began a campaign of dehumanizing Jews. He began by systematically stripping away their identities, isolating them from society, using a barrage of propaganda to portray them as subhuman. He called them dirty and compared them to rats and vermin. But the propaganda also painted them as powerful and cunning and sort of an existential threat to the German nation. Can you talk to us about this messaging and what this history teaches us about how to approach it?
Thank you for the question and thank you for having me. I want to start with talking about the Weimar Republic very specifically because it was a very short-lived democracy. And I think sometimes we forget how young it was, how fragile the Weimar Republic was. The Nazis were one of over 24 political parties in the 1920s vying for the German vote. And it wasn't inevitable that the Nazis would come to power. It's not inevitable that Hitler would become chancellor and that the Nazis would eventually take over Germany as a dictatorship. What we see in the Weimar Republic and what we can learn from it is so multifaceted, but we can look at what were the risk factors and conditions in that society in the 1920s. On one hand, Weimar Republic was in many ways a very progressive space. We had a lot of innovation, a lot of work in the arts, the expressionist movement. We had Jews and other minority groups becoming part of that democracy. But it's more complicated than that. Even in the 1920s, as the Weimar Republic is again, it's a fledgling democracy, there are a lot of factions. And what we see is both the political left and the political right in Weimar Republic vying to be the voice of that country. And when we have those extremes on the left and the right, that is when we start seeing different political parties like the Nazi Party try to appeal to very specific targets within that democracy. And the messaging, the Weimar, that the Nazis choose, is carefully curated. When we talk about risk factors of the Holocaust and the rise of the Nazi Party, it's again a multi-pronged approach. Anti-Semitism is part of that approach, and it's very much part of the Nazi Party's platform, but it's not something they run on, at least not at the beginning.
Okay, we've touched upon this a little bit. There was a period of social and legal isolation of Jews. There was the 1933 boycott of Jewish businesses, the removal of Jews from civil service jobs. Jews were forced to wear a yellow Star of David on their clothing. In April of 1933, the Gestapo began operating in Germany. They were able to bypass standard judicial procedures and act as a secret, decentralized force to eliminate political opposition through surveillance, arrests, and terror. You got into this a little bit, but how was German society able to rapidly deteriorate this way?
I don't know that it happened so rapidly. I would say that the Nazi rise to power and the sort of what unfolds across society, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over a number of years, and it's small steps along the way. And again, at its core, it happens for a variety of reasons. It happens because there is economic, political, and social upheaval in Weimar Republic. And the Nazis, just like many parties of its time, are using those divisions, are using those weaknesses in the democracy as it becomes a dictatorship and Hitler figures out how to maneuver that. That's how we see these changes happen. But again, at its core, it didn't start there. The hatred of Jews, the hatred of others were around for hundreds of years before that. In fact, I always like to remind people that we look back at the Weimar Republic as this moment of democracy, but Jews themselves only received the right to be full citizens in Germany in 1871. It's actually relatively late in the history of the world and certainly in the history of Jews in Europe. And we need to remember that that hatred existed before the Nazis. And the Nazis figure out how to use that for their advantage, but they're not the cause of it. And the decisions that everyday people make are because both of their own education and how they have learned to treat others and outsiders in society, and also the vulnerability that different people have at different moments in their lives. The idea that individuals make choices, institutions make choices, and those choices can change over time.
Is it true that when you're talking about the Holocaust, historians can generally break people down into 5 categories? There's perpetrators, bystanders, some are, the historical term has been upstanders, resistors, and rescuers. Can you explain these categories and also why you might simplify this by asking more people to simply be mensches?
These categories do exist. I personally don't always believe in these categories. A lot of historians take issue with them because I think that when we say someone is an upstander or someone is a bystander or someone is a perpetrator, we're assuming they're only those things for the entire duration of in this case, the Holocaust. And the fact of the matter is that there are people who at one point in time are perpetrators who over time become either bystanders or upstanders. A good example I always like to think about is Martin Niemöller, whose quote, who I is used all the time, talking about, first they came for the socialists, then they came for the Jews. The order changes because he actually never said it once. He said it over the course of his life many times in different iterations. But what's interesting about him is that he was originally a supporter of the Nazi Party. He was very much part of that structure. And over time, as he sees what happens within the Nazi Party and within Germany and beyond, he himself becomes a target and he changes his view. But no one is only one thing. And I think that history is complicated. And I think that's why we study it so much. And that's why it's so important we study it. We need to complicate those narratives a bit more.
This is Lake Effect. I'm WUWM's Maya Ann Silver, speaking with Samantha Abramson of the Holocaust Education Resource Center. So the quote that's in the Holocaust Encyclopedia is that first they came for the socialists and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me, right? That's the quote.
That is the quote that is on the website, yes.
Okay, so you've given an example of how people can choose to be at any moment, whether to resist or not resist. You've made the point that there was a lot more room for resistance in 1933 than there was in 1944. Can you explain why it's so important to take action against a tide of hate before it gets too advanced?
Hate tends to percolate, in particular, and because we're talking about the Holocaust, I'm going to focus on anti-Semitism, though we know that the Nazis had many targets and there are so many forms of hate out there. And anti-Semitism is a good example of how hate works, because anti-Semitism, it tends to shapeshift. So in one moment, anti-Semitism can look like one is as you started the segment earlier, Jews can come across as almost superhuman. The idea that Jews are so smart, so talented, so conniving, that Jews are able to control society. We see those tropes in the world even today, right? The idea of the Jews controlling the media, Jews controlling banks. And that was very much a trope in Nazi Germany. And at the same time, we also have this trope of Jews as cockroaches and rodents and vermin. And these tropes date back to way before medieval times. They go back thousands of years. It's the reason so many Jews were murdered during the Black Plague. Jews were accused of poisoning the wells of Europe. And when we talk about how hate works and how a society can buy into this concept, it is really about those stereotypes that help a society, especially a society that's experiencing that political or social turmoil, really feel that they can blame someone. And because it shapeshifts, anti-Semitism can change over time, and it becomes more and more appealing as a belief system to the average person. In fact, Deborah Lipstadt, the former special envoy on anti-Semitism, calls this the horseshoe. The idea that both the political left and the political right don't really agree on very much, but a common denominator they have is at that top of the horseshoe. That's an area where they all find alignment. And when we're thinking about how this took over, certainly German society, it started slowly. It started with specific propaganda messaging about why did Germany lose World War I, and blaming the Jews for that, or why are we not having enough money after the Great Depression? Well, it's because of the Jews. So we can see how hate really appeals and targets whatever message a society wants or needs in that moment.
In this day and age that we live in, we're getting all these sound bites. You've said in the past that they're meant to divide and cause pain and dehumanize different groups of people. How do you think that we today should respond to that kind of messaging?
The messaging is out there and it's everywhere, right? Like we just go on our phones for 10 seconds and we get all these different social media feeds, and we've never had more information available as a society than we do in this exact moment. And there was a lot of messaging available in the 1930s and 40s as well. In fact, the Nazis were pioneers at propaganda and using technologies to get their messaging out there. So we know what that can do. In this moment, in 2026, and hey, I'm a historian, so I am here to really reflect on the history and the sort of the power of history. And I wouldn't have gone into this work if I didn't feel history was important and relevant for the moment we're in today. And, we at the Holocaust Education Resource Center, we teach students this history because we want them to think. We want them to think critically. We want them to understand media literacy. We want our students to have a toolkit. It is not our job to teach them what to think, but it is our job as historians and educators to give them that toolbox so that they know how to think, how to ask really critical questions, how to look at what the messages they're receiving, again, whether it's in the hallway in their school or on whatever social media platform is way too hip for me to understand today. Whatever it is, we want them to look at that messaging and really interrogate it. What is it saying? Who's saying it? Why are they saying it? And is there another perspective they should go and look for to have a more balanced nuance of where the world is?
Samantha Abramson is the executive director of the Holocaust Education Resource Center in Milwaukee. She spoke with WUWM's Maayan Silver. In about 15 minutes, we'll learn about the craft of cheesemaking from one of Wisconsin's female master cheesemakers. But first, we'll learn about the history of the St. Joan of Arc Chapel on Marquette's campus. Keep listening to Lake Effect on WUWM. You're listening to Lake Effect on Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Here's the latest episode of Bubbler Talk.
Bubbler Talk, quenching Milwaukee's thirst for knowledge.
I'm WUWM's Audrey Nowakowski, and this week's Bubbler Talk takes us to a centuries-old hidden gem at a college campus in downtown Milwaukee.
Yeah, I'm Eric Shane. My Bubbler Talk question is just wanting to know a little more about the St. Joan of Arc Chapel on the Marquette campus.
The Gothic stone chapel certainly stands out among the campus's mix of more modern buildings. While Marquette has been around since 1881, this building is just a bit older than that.
It was first built in the city of Lyon about 1420. It was known as Saint Martin de Sissois, and it was a private family chapel.
That's Robert Newman, a guide at the St. Joan of Arc Chapel. So why is a 600-year-old chapel in the middle of a Milwaukee college campus? And what does it have to do with Joan of Arc? It's kind of a wild ride, so let's start with its first home. The chapel originally served the community of Châteauroux southeast of Lyon, France for over 400 years before falling into disrepair. Although it wasn't in top shape, it still caught the eye of an American who would bring it back to life in the 1920s.
Enter a wealthy patroness, Gertrude Gavin, and her husband Michael Gavin wanted a chapel on their private Long Island estate. And they were very high in Catholic laity, not only because of philanthropy, but also because of the works they did themselves. So they arranged with the Archdiocese of Lyon to have the chapel deconstructed, what was left of it, stone by stone, and rebuilt on Oyster Bay, Long Island.
That's right. The Gavins had the chapel deconstructed and shipped in parts to New York. Gertrude came from railroad money, so I guess that's the kind of thing you can do with obscene wealth. The chapel was going to be next to a French Renaissance chateau the Gavins also purchased and shipped and reassembled from France. To help honor the chapel's style when it was rebuilt, Newman says that Gertrude Gavin hired Boston artist Charles Connick, an expert in medieval French-style stained glass, to create the windows for the chapel.
He agreed to the commission, but he traveled to France for almost a year for two purposes: for inspiration from churches that Joan prayed at, or also from churches she may have prayed at that were around, and to study the art. But he also went to patrimony, exclusive warehouses in France, and purchased glass from medieval French churches so that the color would be authentic and identical to the colors, the blues, the reds, the greens that Joan had seen in the 15th century. Those were incorporated into the chapel in the 1920s, so the claim can be made Joan saw those exact images.
Other objects were added to the chapel when it was reconstructed in Long Island, such as a 13th century altar from Ireland, 15th century wooden beams from France, wooden art pieces, and more to restore it to a functioning place of worship on the Gavins' private property. Now, for the chapel's current namesake, St. Joan of Arc. Originally, the chapel was named after St. Martin, but around the time Gertrude Gavin was rebuilding it at her home, Joan of Arc was being canonized. Here's Dr. Jennifer Vanderheyden, Associate Professor of French and Francophone Studies at Marquette.
We should say when talking about Joan of Arc, there's always the caveat that there's the legend, there's the actual person who did exist, but there are not a lot of public records at the time.
Joan of Arc is the French heroine of the 100 Years' War between England and France in the Middle Ages. She grew up in a small French town that, like many others, was ravaged by the English.
The legend is that she was a peasant girl and keeping the sheep. That probably is not true. Her father did have a function in Domremy as far as, I think he was a tax collector. So they were of minimal means, but they weren't destitute by any means. And she was happy there, but she was very religious. And then she started hearing voices of mainly of three saints that were telling her through God that she was to lead this mission to save France and to go free the city of Orléans.
Joan led the French army to key victories, securing the coronation of Charles VII. But she was captured by the English, convicted of heresy, and burned at the stake. She was only 19. Dr. Vanderheyden says Joan of Arc is an early example of a feminist, though that term didn't exist during the Middle Ages. She was a woman boldly breaking her society's rules around gender.
She was most of all and foremost very religious. I mean, it was a divine mission. If she needed to wear men's clothing in battle, it was practical, obviously. She was captured and accused of heresy, and the wearing of the men's clothes had a lot to do with that accusation. Her mission was divine and patriotic, and that was the aspect of standing up, being independent. She couldn't read or write, so it's not as if she wrote a manifesto, but her words during the trial are also very clear that she obeyed God.
Joan of Arc was posthumously retried and vindicated. She officially became the patron saint of France in 1920. Gertrude Gavin was so captivated by Joan of Arc that she wanted to rename the medieval chapel, the one she had shipped to her New York home, in Joan's honor. Chapel guide Newman explains how she accomplished this.
The Gavins, they petitioned the Archbishop of Brooklyn for permission to rename the chapel from St. Martin to St. Joan. And said, you got to do better. Okay, that's where the stone comes into play.
The stone that he's referring to is called the Joan of Arc stone. It was from a Marian grotto, an outdoor shrine dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Legend has it that Joan stopped to pray there during her travels.
And so she's praying, she finishes her prayers, she kisses the stone, the ground stone that she was laying upon, and then she gets on her horse, a war horse, not a pony, slaps her gauntlet and says, go forth boldly. And they go on to the day. And that stone was acquired from a Marian grotto that was being demolished or dismantled, I'm unsure, in the 1920s. The bishop from that region contacted the Gavins and said, we think you want to put this stone into your chapel. In other words, incorporate it into the building, because then the claim can be made that Joan prayed here.
I had heard the lore that the stone in the Joan of Arc Chapel is a cooler temperature year-round, no matter the season. Newman says some Marquette students looked into it back when the chapel was reconstructed on the campus in the 1960s.
Now, this is legend. I don't see documentation of this. The mechanical engineering students were the first ones to insist on measurement. So they brought their devices and their tools, and they measured the temperature of the stone. And their findings were that the stone where Joan kissed and wept upon is always about 3 degrees cooler. Now, it's been since measured by the physics department using high tech, and it's always cooler.
Want to try it? Yeah. Curious if you
Just
can
use
feel a
the skin
difference.
right here.
Yeah.
And touch any of the stone.
Oh, yeah. No, you can definitely. Yeah.
So how did the chapel end up at Marquette? Well, Gertrude Gavin's estate was purchased by a couple named Mark and Lillian Rotman in 1962. But there was a fire on the property, and everything was lost, except the chapel. The Rotmans wondered who could benefit from what was left. Turns out Lillian Rotman had a relationship with the Haggerty Museum of Art at Marquette.
So it was decided to gift it to Marquette. So after the fire, the chapel was deconstructed stone by stone, loaded onto a truck, cataloged, and brought right where we're sitting right now.
Remember, this is the second time the chapel was deconstructed and moved to a new home. It took workers 9 months to carefully take it apart before it was rebuilt on Marquette's campus. As it was reassembled, some changes were made to add modern conveniences like heat and electricity. It's a mix of ancient and not so ancient.
The nave was elongated when it was first built here in 1966, and again elongated in 2018. So the farther you get away from the main altar area, it becomes more of Wisconsin. So the stone on the outside of the building is Lannon stone from Menominee Falls. Okay, the doors and is modern hardware, but the original hardware and the original woodwork is from France. The bench you're sitting on now is from 1640s, not made at IKEA. It's not going to fall on you. And that was from Normandy, France. So things were bought from other areas and brought in. The altar is a 13th century altar from Ireland. The woodwork on the ceiling is a blending of beams from France from the 15th century and beams from Douglas fir from northern Wisconsin. From where you sit, you can see these beautiful Gothic arches. That's all original stone.
The first shipment of the twice disassembled chapel arrived in Milwaukee on January 31st, 1965, and the chapel officially opened in 1966. Since then, it has served as the heart of the Marquette campus and community. French professor Dr. Vanderheyden explains what it means to her.
I developed an entire course on Joan of Arc, and it was really interesting because to see how much the students, they love the chapel, they love to come to Mass, but a lot of the history they don't really study normally, and we had the first class here. And it's very nice because you don't have all the technical additions, and so we can just sit here and read a text and talk about Joan of Arc.
And chapel guide Newman shares what Father Fred Zagone, the University Advancement Chaplain, says about the chapel.
Father Fred Zagone would always want me to say, if you don't say anything, say this. It's the heart of the Marquette campus, and it's also the oldest building in the Western Hemisphere still being used for its design purpose. Sounds like a Jeopardy question, but that's the chapel.
There are Catholic Masses at the St. Joan of Arc Chapel every day during the school year. Visitors are welcome during or outside of Mass. After spending some time at the chapel with Eric Shane, who submitted the Bubbler Talk question about it, I asked what stood out to him.
Finding out that this is the oldest still functioning structure in the Western Hemisphere is amazing. Yeah, there is definitely a reverence here that's going on that you can feel.
For Lake Effect, I'm Audrey Nowakowski.
Send us your Bubbler Talk question and join us Thursday, February 26th at Ope Brewing for Bubbler Talk Trivia. Details are at WUWM.com.
You can find all our episodes of Bubbler Talk at WUWM.com or as a podcast. And just like Bubbler Talk, Lake Effect is also available as a podcast, so you can listen to us whenever you like. Find it where you get your podcasts, then subscribe, download, and listen on demand. We'll take one more break, and then we'll chat with one of Wisconsin's female master cheesemakers. That's next on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. This is Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Cheese. We love it here in Wisconsin, and the numbers back this fact up. If Wisconsin was a country, we would rank 4th in the world in cheese production, behind the rest of the United States, Germany, and France. Wisconsin also has the only cheesemaker program outside of Europe, and of the master cheesemakers, there are only 4 women. Pam Hodgson of Sotori Cheese in Plymouth, Wisconsin, is one of them. Hodgson's family have been farmers in the area since the 1840s, and the legacy of cheesemaking goes back to her grandfather. We spoke about her work in 2023.
My pathway to cheesemaking, it does have a couple twists and turns. Growing up, I wanted to be a dairy farmer like my parents. It did turn out that my maternal grandfather was a very accomplished cheesemaker, but when I was growing up, I knew him as Grandpa. He was already retired. So my journey to become a dairy farmer took me to University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I studied cows. Great experience. And early on in my husband and I, our farming career, we were just starting out. We needed a little bit more money to fuel the dream. So there was an opening at a cheese plant in the area for a quality assurance supervisor. And I took the job, and once I was in the plant, I just fell in love with cheese making. I think it's a little bit of a joke on our family in that I had no intention of becoming a cheesemaker, but like my maternal grandfather, it turned out to be a fantastic career for me.
What were some of the things that you were immediately drawn to when you took that first job?
I loved working in the cheese plant when I started in 1991 because, one, there's always something going on. We ran milk around the clock, and when we weren't making cheese, we were cleaning the equipment that we used. So there was always something going on. I liked the satisfaction of, at the end of the day, we had a cooler full of cheese that we had made. We could see the results of our hard work. And then cheese making is challenging. It's physically challenging. It can be very hard work depending on what job you're doing. It challenges a person intellectually. We always have to, as cheesemakers, we have to listen to the process and make adjustments to the process based on what the milk is doing or what the curd is doing. It's not the same every day because our major component, milk, changes a little bit every day seasonally depending on stage of lactation, environment, what cows are being fed. So there's always something to challenge a person. And then all of my cheesemaking experiences have been in plants where it was a team working together. And I really thrive and enjoy that. I enjoy working with people and seeing people develop and become more accomplished cheesemakers or more accomplished in whatever it is they want to do.
And the practice of cheesemaking itself, it's referred to as an art typically, but for you it's both an art and a science and not one or the other, right?
Correct. I think probably the right term would be craft, because there's a lot of skill, there is science, but there's also a lot of science that we haven't yet discovered. As an accomplished cheesemaker will always pay close attention to the process and make adjustments as needed. And then kind of related to that, as I think about cheesemaking, how my maternal grandfather knew it compared to how I know it, over the years we've been able to harness technology to help us be more consistent. But that technology doesn't replace the eye of the cheesemaker. It doesn't replace paying attention to the process and making adjustments. What automation or technology does for us is it helps us be more consistent. But in itself, it doesn't make us better. It takes the cheesemaker to make the cheese good, or to make good cheese. And kind of related to that as well is technology on the farm. In the, 30-some years that I've been making cheese, I'm just impressed on how much the quality of milk has improved during that time frame. And it's because we have hardworking family farms who are really dedicated to producing high-quality milk. And they, too, are harnessing technology to help their operations become better, to make their milk be better.
Exactly. And on the note of how things have shifted and changed and improved, there's obviously so many elements that go into making cheese. So we're going to focus on one of the beginning stages, which is starter bacteria. So can you explain what that is and the importance of it?
Yes. So as cheesemakers in general, there's a lot of different ways to make cheese. But when we think about cheddar or Parmesan, lots of cheeses, we are using starter bacteria which ferment the lactose in the milk, which brings the pH down, which, if we think about the ancient art of cheesemaking, that was really important from a food preservation standpoint. So we're managing a biological process as cheesemakers. We also will add starters. The purpose isn't to convert lactose into lactic acid. They work down the line as the cheese is aging, and they'll create some of the flavors that we absolutely love in cheese because they're breaking down the proteins. It's a very interconnected process to partner with bacteria to make great cheese.
Right. So with starter bacteria, how has this element developed or changed over time compared to, say, when your grandfather was using starters?
Yes. So when my grandfather was making cheese, he did a process which was called mothering the culture. So he would have some culture, he would grow it in small batches, and then he would grow that again. You could think of it a little bit like a process of sourdough bread, right? You're keeping back some of your starter to make the next batch of starter. And at that point, he would not have known what strains were in his starter, and he probably did not have just one strain in his starter as well. If we compare that to what we do now, is now we're using defined strains where we know what that bacteria is. We're monitoring it to make sure that its performance doesn't change over time. Growing up, I'd hear stories about how somebody's starter had failed, and they'd come to George Hintz to get his starter, and cheesemakers would help each other out. And we'll also enter contests, and we'll compete really hard, and we all want to win that contest. But when the contest is over, we're also genuinely happy for whoever did win. So it's a really neat community to be part of the Wisconsin cheesemaking scene.
One thing that I imagine, say, your grandfather had to deal with was a lack of automation, like things when it comes to heat control or other processes in the cheese-making stages. Are those good basic building blocks that allow you to be more creative in the process down the road when you are developing cheese?
Absolutely. Growing up, I would hear stories of pretty much how much my grandfather hated his wood-fired boiler because he had inconsistent steam control. So he'd be fighting that instead of focusing on cheese making. Today we have very good control of our temperatures, and that's really important because as we work to create American originals, cheeses that will make Wisconsin proud, we need to have the control so that if we invent this great cheese and It's just fantastic. But we have to be able to replicate it, because each time a consumer comes and buys this piece of Wisconsin cheese, they want it to be the same goodness as it was last time. So automation really allows us to do that, but automation does not replace the skill and observation of a cheesemaker.
If anything, does it make the challenge of standing out even more satisfying?
So when we think about cheesemaking, it's an ancient art. I mean, it goes back millennials, right? So, and around the world, there's just thousands of different kinds of cheeses. So if we look at that and we're like, wow, we want to create American original, and that's a really big focus at Sartori. We want to create American originals. We'll look to anyone around the world for inspiration, but we don't want to copy somebody else's great cheese. We want to make our own, and even something as common as a cheddar, we'll put our own signature on it. So if you just look at it from that standpoint, it is kind of daunting to think about, well, we want to create something new that somebody else hasn't had. But what kind of grounds me on all that is the creativity process. What I find in being creative is I get very balanced on right brain and left brain activities. So part of me is like, okay, if I look at this process and how traditionally this process has been done, well, if I do what everybody else has done, I'm going to end up what everybody else already has. So how can I do it differently? And then the analytical part of me is looking at the data after we've made the cheese and made multiple vats of the cheese and understanding, well, if we make more acidity early in the process, what is the consequence later on in the finished product? So, as we talked earlier about falling in love with the process, I absolutely love this part, that freedom to be creative, and then also the analytical opportunities that it provides for me. So yeah, it's a daunting challenge to come up with pleasing original cheeses, yet collectively Wisconsin cheesemakers are up to the task.
When you are experimenting on something new and taking note the aging process of cheese, when do you typically know that you're onto something?
Well, that's a good question. I think our finance department would like me to know really, really quick. But in reality, yeah, right. But in reality, most of the cheeses at Sartori, we end up aging about a year before we really know if we have something or not. And that's kind of daunting, too, when you think about how many chances a person gets to get it right in their lifetime. If we look at our Cervecchio Parmesan, it's a cheese that we age a minimum of 20 months. I mean, yeah, you can get early reads, and we do take early reads. But when you think about developing a long-hold cheese, as a cheesemaker, it's pretty humbling, because how many chances are you really going to get to optimize that cheese?
I love hearing you talk about all these different elements that we as consumers often don't know about and the enjoyment you take out of it. With your career and elevating up to the rank of cheese master, what's a key lesson that you've learned either from your family of cheesemakers or just through your years in this career that you always keep in mind?
Well, certainly I've learned a lot. One phrase that I use quite a bit to keep me grounded, I guess, very early on, I was working in a very male-dominated plant, and cheese making historically has been rather male-dominated. So in general, early in my career, there's a lot of people who are super, super helpful, very supportive. But there were a few people, too, who actually kind of worked against me, who kind of made things harder. And I came across a Mark Twain quote that goes like this: "Stay away from people who belittle your ambitions. Small people always do that. But the truly great ones make you believe that you too can become great." And in the beginning, hearing that quote, it gave me strength. Today, when I hear that quote, it gives me a lot of humility, because I have so much more to learn and so much more to accomplish as a cheesemaker. Yet it reminds me that it's important to be bringing up the next generation of cheesemakers, encouraging them, helping them find experiences to help them grow. And it's really, really, really humbling, because if I do a good job of teaching people what I've learned, Well, they're going to take that and they're going to learn things on their own, which means that I'm helping develop people who will be better than me. And I mean, that's how it should be. But I've also worked really, really hard to get to where I am. So it's very, very humbling. But, you know, it's also part of our Wisconsin dairy pride, right? We always want to be improving. We want to make great cheese. I mean, after all, we have America's Dairyland on our license plate. That should mean something, right? So it's a neat dairy state of mind, I think.
Absolutely. Well, I thank you for your contributions to not just our palates, but our dairy state of mind. And I've loved learning more about it. Thanks, Pam.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.
Pam Hodgson is a master cheesemaker at Sartori Cheese in Plymouth, Wisconsin. We spoke in 2023 when there were only 2 female master cheesemakers in the state. Now there are 4. And that wraps up Lake Effect for today. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. If you've missed any of Lake Effect this week, you can find all of our conversations at wuwm.com. If you'd like to take the show on the go, download the Lake Effect podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. Tomorrow on Lake Effect, we'll bring you some of the top stories from the week, including a look at the point-in-time count in Milwaukee, which helps give a snapshot of how many people are experiencing homelessness locally. Thank you so much for joining us today, right here on listener-supported 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.